Taoiseach, the situation at RTE is an unholy mess and a scandal that has done extraordinary damage to the vital institution of public service broadcasting in this country. Secret payments mislabelled as consultancy, an organised deception of the public, the Dáil and the workers in RTE, a barter account that looks like a slush fund, and then 3 barter accounts that may look like slush funds. No accountability about any of this. Staggering salaries for a favoured few at the top. A group of people who work week in, week out for RTE and look just like employees, but are labelled as consultants or contractors. An obnoxious notion of the talent for a few at the top, suggesting that the vast majority of people who actually make the programmes and make the institution work are not somehow talent. All of this is an insult to the TV licence paying public who can go to jail if they don't pay their TV licence, and to the vast majority of the RTE workers, journalists, crew and so on who actually make RTE function. Now, it is welcome that Ryan Tubridy and Noel Kelly are coming into the committees, and as soon as Dee Forbes and Jim Jennings are recovered, I hope they will also be coming in, because Siún Ní Raghallaigh, in response to a question I asked last week, acknowledged that there was an organised deception. Those were her words, an organised deception. Now, we don't know who organised it, but somebody organised it. And those people need to be held to account. And we need to know, is there more? Is there more? I think questions have to be asked about the contract for services to RTE. Were they tendered out in a transparent way? I've heard, for example, issues around chauffeur services that weren't properly tendered out. I've asked about the independent production fund and whether similar things are going on in film production, where certainly allegations have been made along those lines. And of course, we need an audit and reviews of the entire matter and the culture and governance of RTE. But I put it to you, Taoiseach, that right now certain things are very clear and evident. We need salary caps on these staggering and exorbitant salaries that are aligned with public sector pay scales. We need direct employment of people who are actually employees of RTE rather than contractors bargaining for extraordinary salaries. And we need a proper funding model for RTE that is not contaminated by commercial and advertising imperatives where I think this rot that we have seen over the last number of weeks starts.
Thanks very much, Deputy. RTE is a public body. It's also a semi-state or a state-owned enterprise. And there are a set of salary caps that apply in state-owned enterprises. And there is a code of practice for commercial semi-states as to how they're supposed to operate or not. And we're going to have to establish now very quickly as to whether any of the caps that exist were broken and whether the code of practice for commercial semi-states was breached too. The use of contractors and the use of consultants is done in the public sector, it's done in the private sector, it's also done in the semi-state sector, and there are advantages and disadvantages both for the body and for the individuals involved. One thing, for example, that doesn't arise if somebody is a contractor or consultant is pension liabilities. We do not have to pay their pensions when they retire. We do not have to pay redundancy, for example. So there's lots of different things that need to be taken into account. When you take account of those things, the cost of a pension for a retired public servant is extremely high. If you think about it, half their salary for the rest of their lives. So when it comes to saving money and so on, all of that needs to be borne in mind. The same thing goes for redundancy and dismissal. But all these things need to be examined. For exactly that reason, the government agreed to proposals yesterday to initiate a root and branch examination. This will comprise 2 elements: an independent review to examine the governance structures and organisational culture of RTE, overseen by an expert governance advisory committee and an independent review to examine the mechanisms by which external contractors are engaged, the fees paid, the use of agents and other HR matters in RTE, all of which you mentioned in your question. And that will be overseen by an expert advisory committee on contractor fees and HR matters. In addition to that, the Minister is invoking her powers under the Broadcasting Act to appoint a forensic accountant to examine the accounts of RTE. The initial focus of the forensic accountant will be on the barter accounts and any other off-balance sheet accounts. We expect to have that person in place next week.
Taoiseach, there is simply no justification for a small number of people at the top getting salaries that are multiples of what the ordinary journalists and crew and workers in RTE get. Because you see, this notion of the talent implied a sort of hierarchy. But the truth is, to make a show, you don't just need a contractor, highly paid presenter, you need sound people, you need researchers, you need a producer, you need all sorts of people who are just as important for the creation of those shows, and there is no justification for these staggering salaries or for people who in actuality are working for RTE being treated as if they're contractors bargaining for extortionate salaries. That starts this kind of rot. And secondly, I heard Minister McGrath earlier on saying he doesn't think necessarily the impact of advertising and commercial interests in RTE are detrimental to the integrity of public service broadcasting. I disagree. I think at the root of this is the fact that what is supposed to be a public service broadcaster were more interested in commercial revenues and then thinking they deserved the salaries and getting involved in these barter accounts with these commercial and advertising interests.
Thanks. Thanks, Deputy. This is an emerging situation and it's evolving. There are two reflections that I shared last week in Brussels, which I'd like to share again. I do think there's an issue with the interplay of the Executive Board and the Board. It's an unusual structure for a company or a public body. We're going to have to establish whether that was part of the problem here and a significant part of the problem. Things that would have gone to a board in a normal organisation didn't and were dealt with at Executive Board level. The other is the interplay of commercial revenue and public revenue, and you may well have a good point in that regard. Many of us here are trustees of political parties. We have to keep separate accounts for the money we get from the public and the money we raise from our supporters. And we have to make sure that public money is only spent for the purpose for which it was voted by the Oireachtas. And in RT it all seems to go into the one pot. And I think that's a problem. And that may be something that has to change. The other thing I would say, and I think it is a valid point in relation to contractors, for example, bear in mind an employee is somebody who you take on, they get full employment rights, and you pay them for the rest of their life. You don't just pay them while they're an employee, you pay them a pension for 20 or 30 years after they've retired. When you're comparing the cost of something, I think you have to take that into account.